coming to you from LARB HQ in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, California. This is the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down today with Steph Cha, author of a new Los Angeles noir. It's probably been a while since one has come out and especially gotten this much attention. It's called Follow Her Home. Steph, the main character in this book, Juniper Song, is thrust into a Philip Marlowe type situation. What possibilities first came to your mind when you thought, what if I put a 20-something lady today into a Marlowe type situation? What does the modern world, modern Los Angeles, give me that it didn't give Raymond Chandler in his day?
So in terms of story, that came second, I would say. I wanted to create a contemporary atmosphere that was accurate in the way that Chandler's LA was accurate back in the 40s and 50s. And I read Chandler when I was in college. I read all of his books and I loved them. And I particularly loved what they did with LA because I grew up here. And there was just something so intensely atmospheric and concrete and definitive about his voice and the way he writes about Los Angeles that I thought originally someone should do that with contemporary LA. This thought obviously came to me when I was in college and first reading him, and I later learned that people have been doing that, but I did want there to be a kind of LA noir with a Korean American bent because that's just been my experience growing up here, and I know a lot of other Korean Americans living in LA who were born here, second generation, and it's a very particular experience that I want to describe. So at some point I thought that there was this kind of hole in literature and I thought that I might be able to fill it, so I decided to write it with that in mind. I think also just the incredible diversity of this city and the sprawling aspect, which, I mean, has only gotten bigger since Chandler was writing, and I wanted to kind of capture that modern LA where you can't just go around calling people fairies, and so I wanted to do that kind of update a little bit with a feminist bent, because that's another part that I didn't agree with Chandler, is like it's a very misogynist vision. So that was kind of the project, and so I decided to write this noir, and then I wanted to write about yellow fever and different things that are kind of linked and kind of noirish about the Asian American experience in LA.
Reading Chandler, getting that atmosphere of Los Angeles that he described, that he built up, maybe created to some extent, did you think to yourself, yeah, that's Los Angeles, or I think the atmosphere is different now and I need to capture a new one?
I think I thought both at the same time. I mean, it's very recognizable. I think some of the gritty LA, I mean, it's not, and I should say that that's not an LA that I necessarily grew up with. Like, I didn't see anything particularly seedy or strange growing up in the suburbs, but I think Chandler really defined LA in a way that's lasted, through present day. That kind of dirtiness that you associate with LA and Hollywood, that's still part of the vision of LA, and it's not always accurate, but sometimes it is, as it is about, I think most cities will have that kind of underbelly, but so I think that has lasted, and I actually saw a list of definitive LA novels recently. Somebody sent it to me. And somebody sent it to me because The Big Sleep was on there. But I also noticed it was a list of like 15, 20 books, and I think like 5 of them were noir. There was like Mosley and Elroy, and it just makes sense that it would be that way. On the other hand, I don't think every aspect is recognizable. I mean, LA has changed so much over the last century that, like, a certain, I think one element is like the incredible diversity of this city, and how, I mean, I'm repeating myself, but like how big it's become and how pocketed. I think that was starting to be true, but the breadth of Los Angeles of present day doesn't really come across in Chandler's novels. Like, for an example is, like, if you look at the downtown that Chandler lived in, I think the tallest building was, like, City Hall. You know, you wouldn't recognize the skyline. And he makes references to the occasional Mexican who gets that designation, like, is the Mexican, and who won't really have many lines. So I don't know if Chandler really anticipated a city with this heavy an immigrant population. He definitely did not live in a world with so many Asian American immigrants. Because, like, for instance, the Korean American immigration wave came in the 70s. That's, like, when my parents came in. And, you know, I know very few third-generation Koreans. The ones I would know are children. And so I think that particular population certainly isn't captured or even imagined in Chandler's work.
The writer Richard Meltzer has this phrase that I've always liked. He talks about the world moving into Los Angeles, especially after the 1984 Olympics, and that cultural breadth is something that I don't recognize in Chandler's Los Angeles. I was like, I moved to Los Angeles because there's every culture here. Yeah. This is a place with very, very few cultures in it. Ultimately, it was still an interesting one in his day, but we have Los Angeles noir novels. We've long had them. We've long had immigrant experience novels, Asian American experience novels, Korean American experience novels. It seems like, I mean, when did it occur to you that it was possible to hybridize those? I mean, do you think of this as a project of hybridizing those forms?
Yeah, I very much wanted to do that. I think what it was is that I didn't want to write an explicit identity novel. I think something in me rebelled against that, at least for my first book. I think I may yet write an identity novel because I find Asian American identity interesting. I mean, and it's something that I live with. But I think because most writers, you know, writers who are white, do not have to write an identity novel. They can just write a novel, and it can be about a character who is white, and nobody pays attention to that. That's not a salient point. So I really wanted to write a novel where it wouldn't make sense if you just swapped out the main character for a white character, but where it wasn't all about the character's Koreanness. And I have liked novels that are about characters' ethnicity. I think that's a very strong genre, but I wanted to collapse the two because noir, there's always something going on where the identities of the characters are there and felt, but they're not the main thrust. And I think I really wanted to do that for this project. And I also think noir is a particularly good way to explore identity in that way anyway, because the private detective is kind of an observer character. And, you know, things can happen to her, but she ultimately just kind of narrates and takes you through what's going on in the particular setting. Like, the private detective will go all over a city. That's one of my favorite things about a private detective. And so you can see it through her eyes, but it's not about who she is 100%.
I mentioned off mic before recording that my girlfriend read this book before I did, and she expressed relief that, oh good, there's no scene where the Korean American remembers her embarrassment at bringing gimbap to school for lunch that her immigrant mom packed. And I feel that way too. I've read a few identity novels myself, and the first few times I read that kind of scene, I was like, oh, that really must have been awkward. And then it started to feel like a cliche. And now it's not just a cliche, but I don't think kids are embarrassed if they bring gimbap to school. Yeah. They want to bring it to school. I would want to bring it to school.
I mean, I have gimbap experiences. When my mom packed me gimbap in high school, she would way overpack. So I had tons and tons of it, and I gave a lot away, and it was a total hit. You weren't embarrassed,
it was there.
It was a total hit. People loved it. I mean, I've had embarrassing things packed for lunch. Like, there was a phase where I really liked those, like, Costco dumplings. And that's not something that only Asians eat or anything, no doubt. But they smell really bad. Yes. So I had embarrassing experience with those. But, yeah, and I think, like, the kimbap to school moment is probably very prevalent in this kind of literature because it does happen to everyone. Like, it's funny, like, there are all these strange stories that are shared by whole populations, and that's definitely one of them.
And I think of other generations of Asian American identity novel writers like Chung Rae Lee, who is probably 50 or so now, and probably was embarrassed to bring that stuff in his lunch. But it's like correct me if I'm wrong, or this is too broad, but it's kind of that stuff is now cool, or cool in a way it wouldn't have been in 1970.
I think so. I think. Well, okay, so I'm trying to think what it's like to be like 10 years old now, because I know what it's like to be in my 20s now, and I wonder if it's also different for kids who are much younger. I think that there is a celebration, especially in like east side of Los Angeles, of things like diversity and trying new things and experiencing other cultures. I don't know how much that holds in the playground. On the other hand, when I was in elementary school, I was the only Korean kid in my class. That's no longer true.
In the Valley, near Los Angeles, you were the only Korean kid in your class. Yeah. Wow. That I wouldn't have expected. That's
I went to private elementary school, so I think that might have been part of it. But even that school, I know there's like a lot more Koreans, because I have a brother who's 12 years younger than me, went kind of the same path. He has a lot more Korean classmates.
Now, the protagonist of your novel, your Marlowe, Juniper Song, she makes the claim many times that she is no Marlowe herself, and a lot of the book is about the differences in her experiences and Marlowe's, preparing them for the same type of situation: murders, crimes, conspiracy, that sort of thing, dark alleys, warehouses. But Marlowe always seemed to be, he kept on an eerily even keel, as I recall. Song, as she goes by, she seems to be quick to reach emotional heights. She's got a higher emotional amplitude vastly than Marlowe. Was that an intentional, I want to make them very different in this way?
Yeah, and part of that is that this is an amateur detective, and I wanted, when I was writing it, every juncture where something major happened, I would think, well, how would I react to this? How would my friends react to this? And it just turns out that the way Marlowe reacts to things is strongly informed by what he does for a living, for one thing. But also, I mean, he's just unrealistically cool a lot of the time, which is fine. And I love that about Marlowe and those novels. I mean, there's this hard-bittenness that is, you want to root for that. But I definitely wanted to write this story in a way that the average 20-something woman or man could relate to, because when these things happen to kind of normal people who don't do this for a living, they're going to react in vastly different ways. And I mean, I had fun with that. I think that was just like a fun part of writing it. There's a moment in Twin Peaks, the beginning of Twin Peaks, where the kind of naive-ish police officer sees the murdered body and just like breaks down in tears when he's supposed to be photographing it. I find that like very touching. I find that kind of human reaction. It stands out in this kind of thing because we're so conditioned to see people kind of coming across death and spoil and be completely, unbothered. And so I wanted to bring in somebody who was kind of reacting to this in a way that would ring true.
Right. The action of Follow Her Home happens in a world where there seem to be no Marlowes, where it's not possible for somebody exactly like Philip Marlowe to exist. What other layers of classic noir, the classic noir type reality, did you want to strip away, or did you find not very useful, or did you find useful to take away? What are the old assumptions that you wanted to get rid of from noir?
Well, the big one is the Femme Fatale, and I wanted to play with that figure in a major way. The Femme Fatale character it's a great one. And I'm just thinking of cinema and like all the like Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity. I mean, she's so great, and like they exude this charisma and darkness that is very attractive. On the other hand, it's a very misogynist trope. And I think, it's weird how, and I talk about this in my novel at some point, it's weird how a woman can't just be beautiful. She has to be beautiful and sinful or tainted in some way, often evil and murderous. Whereas, a man is handsome and that's like just part of it. But so I wanted to play with that figure, and I have a lot of women in this novel, and some are bad, some are good, but I wanted to kind of upend the idea that like a femme fatale is like absolutely necessary for a noir novel to work, because it is kind of a little bit hateful to have that figure in like every novel like Chandler did.
Well, bottom line, you don't want to use the same type of figure in every novel, no matter what. Yeah. Even if it's non-hateful, it's like, it just, there's certain things are cliches in noir. It seems like, there's a character, Laurie Lim, introduced in this book who, like a few elements in the book, comes in and seems to be a classic noir element, like a femme fatale. And then, as I read the book, I saw enough of the elements get de-cliched, get de-broadened, or get surprised by what you made them into, if not the opposite of the classic noir image, then you complicated them. Eventually I started seeing the pattern and wanted to see what you would do with everything that seemed classically noirish. But did you see that as a task of yours to make something, to bring in elements, characters, what have you, that seemed like old noir, and then kind of pull the rug out from that?
Yeah, I definitely wanted to do that. I mean, and like I said, like I've said several times, I really love that genre, and I like the idea of playing with it. I think it's hard to do a straight noir these days. It's such a it's a genre that gets parodied often for good reason, and I think it's hard to do with a straight face without playing with various elements or adding like particular twists. I mean, I've noticed like some of the noirs that I've read recently are like Motherless Brooklyn. You have a character with Tourette's. What's it called? The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which I haven't read. But that's an autism noir, right? Right.
It's he has Asperger's, or I guess he's far along enough on the spectrum that things don't look the same to him as they do for us.
Yeah, I haven't read it. And A Turn of Mind, which is not totally noir, but it involves Alzheimer's. And I mean, I think you just can't play this genre straight anymore. And I think that's good. I think you get a lot of, like, the two of those three novels that I've read are very good novels. But I consciously pulled a lot of stuff from Chandler, and I do it pretty explicitly also. And I do it because I like those tropes, but I also enjoy playing with them and subverting them, because I think that's the fun of writing in this genre now.
And one of the more subtle subversions it seems like you've done here is that, I mean, it's been a while since you've no doubt read more classic noir novels than I have, so tell me if this is true, but the main characters or the narrators, if they were identical, could be shambolic or kind of sleazy themselves, just not great guys, but they tended to be reliable narrators in a purely literary, technical sense. Yeah. I get the feeling, not that Juniper Song, your protagonist, is an unreliable narrator per se, but you didn't want to make her perfectly reliable. It feels like not a lot of the book, but maybe 30% of what she says, throw a number out there, is colored in a way that suggests we might want to take her with a grain of salt sometimes. This is getting a little bit abstract, but does that ring true to you as what you wanted to make her?
Yeah, definitely. I wanted her to be a character who doesn't necessarily know herself 100%. And I think, and this is kind of different from noir. I mean, she's a younger character than Marlowe, and she's somebody who is kind of lost in the scheme of things without really acknowledging that. I mean, she's somebody who doesn't really have any goals, feels disconnected from family and friends, but likes to think that she's 100% in charge of everything all the time.
Why does she think that?
I think it's just a need for strength, a dislike of vulnerability. I guess you could put it that way also. And I feel that way sometimes, that I really feel it's important to feel that I'm in charge of things, or that I know what I'm doing with my life. And I think when you feel like that very intensely, it means that you're not. And I wanted to have that kind of element of being kind of adrift in your 20s to be part of her character.
20-something adriftness is something the coverage of this book has brought up. And do you think that 20-something adriftness is more in the zeitgeist now than it's been before? It seems like people people are talking. I'm in my 20s too, but people are talking more about the way our generation, our age group, is supposedly completely lost. What's going on there?
Oh boy, it's probably because none of us have jobs anymore.
That's true. Fair point.
I mean, that's a lot of it. I think, when 2008 hit us, I was in school at the time. Most of the people I know were in school or getting out of school around that time. I mean, I graduated college in 2007. And I think, we were kind of hit hard. And so I understand why that's now in the culture. People want to... there was that Joel Stein article in Time.
Yes.
Calling us a bunch of narcissists. And I don't know. I mean, there's all this, there are so many essays about girls that show
Yes.
I mean, people just like talking about it now. It's a popular topic. I mean, I think anytime there's going to be a scrabble for resources and everyone's kind of feeling desperate. I mean, there's a little bit of venom between generations and a desire to hate on certain types of people in broad strokes. And I mean, I think that's just more visible than it has been before. I mean, I almost want to blame girls entirely because I feel like half of the stuff I read about this is framed in terms of girls.
It's an easy target at this point.
It's an easy target. Everyone's unlikable, but I don't know. I mean, I would have thought that 20-somethings were always a little bit adrift, but I think it's becoming more so now because people are staying in school longer and not finding jobs that can support them with which they can support themselves or pay loans back. And so we are all reduced functionally to some sort of childishness just because we don't have the resources we need.
And it's in this type of deep 20-something semi-employedness that we find Song when she's thrown into this noir plot. I mean, she's approached by her best friend who says, I think my dad has a mistress. He thinks it's this character Lori Lim, this possible femme fatale. It seems certainly like that when we first see her. And it deepens, the proverbial rabbit hole we go down it. Things turn out to be more sinister than they seem. How sinister, how bad, how malevolent did you think it was realistic to ultimately make the goings-on that are revealed in this book? I mean, there's only so much evil you can put in a book before things get implausible. You certainly don't cross that line, but what was that? How did you frame that in your mind? How purely bad do I want anybody in this cast of characters to turn out to be? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I absolutely know what you mean. And I mean, whenever I read mysteries or watch kind of crime type movies or shows, there's always that question of, is this at all believable? And I think it comes down to just, if you set up the motivations correctly, you can make most things plausible, right? I mean, and this is what I look for all the time when I read or view. Actually, I mean, I have this weird habit of reading horror movie synopses on Wikipedia.
Sure.
It's really weird. I don't like horror movies, but I'm for some reason fascinated by that goriness.
Yeah.
But I'm always unsatisfied when I'm well, I don't know why this happened.
Right.
So I think as long as you can set that up, it's plausible. And I feel like this comes directly from a lecture I heard in my American detective fiction class about the kind of thing that would make somebody, secrets that people will kill for. I think we talked about this one news story maybe where a football player had sex with a classmate who later turned out to be a boy, and I think this football player, maybe some other people gang together to kill this person, which is so crazy, but the reason was there. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible reason, obviously, but you can kind of get behind the psychology of it, even though it's this totally crazy thing. I mean, totally crazy things happen all the time. If you read, if you read about the kinds of murders that happen in this country, and I think as long as you can set that up, it's plausible. I mean, I didn't want it to be the kind of book where there's just a bloodbath for no reason. But I kind of went with, what are some weird psychological things I can set up, and like what would come out of that?
Right. I'm thinking of all the characters in Follow Her Home, and we have Song, we have Luke, the friend that says, I think my dad has a mistress. We have his father, the eminent lawyer who may or may not have a mistress. We have Diego, Song's ex-boyfriend. We have a rival private investigator, a classic noir type of character. We have, the list goes on, but I'm thinking of all the characters, and I'm thinking, who is the bad guy? And there's one character who is definitely crazy, but no one I can label for sure bad. Does my reading make sense to you there?
Yeah. I mean, I think of it as having like a couple bad guys, but I didn't leave anyone to kind of rot with no... Every character has something you can latch on to and feel a little compassion for. I think if you don't have that, that's when it gets cartoonish. You can't just have someone be evil for no reason. It doesn't make sense unless... I mean, I guess it sometimes makes sense. I guess people are evil for no reason, but I don't find that as compelling. So I really wanted to make it so that anyone who does a bad thing, you kind of see why they did it. And it's either to, like, people do bad things for good reasons sometimes. They're not, those good reasons are often paired with extreme selfishness or cowardice, but, sometimes you're looking out for somebody else, or you're trying to do right by somebody, and there's just no right way to do that.
And Song is quite quick to see villains, is she not? I mean, once she sets her sights on somebody that she decides is bad, that's when she is the least cold-blooded of all, right?
Yeah. No, she quickly identifies villains, and I think part of that is that she's coming into this with the idea that she's in a mystery now, and in a mystery there are bad guys, and you have to be able to spot them, and that's like the whole idea behind a mystery. I mean, I wanted this to be a book in which like she starts out just in her normal day-to-day, and then gets knocked out, which is the beginning of the mystery part, and then after that she sees herself as part of this kind of Philip Marlowe-esque world where certain things are supposed to happen and certain people are supposed to be certain ways, and that's not always correct, but I wanted her to go in with that kind of viewpoint.
And she does, yes, you mentioned get knocked out in the way that Marlowe would, but the first time she does, she wakes up on Larchmont and Beverly by the old Kookaroo. Now a Chipotle, I think, but it's sort of like the Los Angeles of today. You can get knocked out in, but you'll wake up by a Chipotle or by a Kookaroo. I mean, there's a certain, like, does the Los Angeles now seem a little cheaper than Chandler's?
Yeah, and I had fun writing that scene because I think this survived the cut, but I talk about like the Kookaroo chicken kind of like looking down at her. And I mean, I always thought that Kookaroo chicken was just really funny. It kind of cracks me up. I don't see it that much anymore. But yeah, it's the kind of place with where that can happen, right? Where like there are bus benches everywhere, and they're always going to be plastered with posters or under different logos. I didn't go too much into any of this, but I wanted that to be part of the background for sure.
Song says something toward the end of the book. I forget the exact phrasing, but she's not a player in this game. She's a reader. And so much of how she perceives the situation, these murders, these crimes, these people and places and things she has to find, she perceives, as you've said, in terms of noir novels, in terms of other books she's read. I wonder, how much do you think that's to her advantage as the protagonist of this book, to see so much framed in such literary terms?
I think it certainly helps her in that her knowledge of noir is kind of a substitute for any real training, at least in her mind. I mean, she's not the most competent person, or she's not as competent as she thinks she is, but, she kind of uses Marlowe as this guide. And using Marlowe as a guide is probably not a good idea in everyday life. It is helpful to her, and it helps her get in and out of certain situations, and helps her to navigate. But I think it's to her advantage in that it helps her navigate this world. But, on the other hand, she does not come out on top in a lot of ways. And she has to, I mean, a lot of this is the hand she's dealt, but her kind of literary mindedness, I don't think, it doesn't save her from anything. It doesn't save anybody else. I think it's a tool only. And for that, it's useful.
There's a scene that really expresses to me Song as a reader. It's in, I guess you'd call it a subplot, when she's remembering the time that she suspected that her younger sister Iris was having an affair with her teacher. She goes to find the teacher. The teacher's not home, but she's in she finds her way into his room like a true investigator would, and snoops around and sees he has, what does she say? His bookshelves have some books on Asian history, some Korean English dictionaries, Lolita, and that crystallizes a lot of it for her right there. Here, okay, we've got a fetishist on our hands, and I was thinking, geez, I've got a Korean English dictionary, I've got Asian history books, like, I don't have Lolita, but I've got other to book off. How far would I be from being... What does Song see this teacher as?
Well, are those the only books on your bookshelf?
No, I have hundreds of them. Were these the only books on this guy's shelf?
I think that was the idea, that it's like all that he's interested in is kind of Asian history. I think I said he had maybe a Murakami novel or something. I mean, and this is something that's kind of hard to define. I don't think an Asian fetishist looks only one way, but I mean, I've encountered several just by growing up in LA, and I studied East Asian studies and Japanese in college, and you do come across a certain type who is who loves Asian women as a part of loving this other part of the world, just in general. And it's kind of this strange, reductive sort of vision of women. And so, I mean, I kind of laid that, I laid out his room with all these signals that he's just very interested in everything Asian. Because I think there's a lot of this is wrapped up in Japan, strangely, more than Korea. And
certainly in the last 30 years, Japan. Maybe that may change very soon.
Yeah, but yeah, the fascination with anime and it becomes this, and no one thing is definitive, and obviously if people are interested in these things, and they're things that are you can legitimately be interested in. I've had interest in anime and all that, but it becomes weird when you combine that with a very personal preference for one kind of woman. And I think that happens with Asian women for some reason more than it does with any other race, it seems like.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've known a lot of guys who are, for example, mad about redheads. Only a redhead will do. The redheads don't complain. I've known guys who were only attracted to black women. When they didn't hear anything about it, no one would bring it up. It'd be like Robert De Niro. No one points that out about him, but it's clearly true. But if a guy who only likes Asian women will not declare that for fear he's going to be called a fetishist, culturally, what do you think is going on there?
And I should clarify that I mean, I'm getting married to a white man. It's not that I have any problems with interracial relationships with Asian women.
I guess I should put out that my girlfriend is from Korea right there. So are we well placed or poorly placed to be talking about this right now?
I think we're probably well placed because I'm sure you've thought about it, right?
It's not far from my mind. Yeah. That's true.
I mean, this is something that I think about sometimes. Yeah. And I think it's just because the desire for Asian women is very wrapped up with this idea of Orientalization and where Eastern cultures are kind of seen as softer spoken, weaker, more submissive, and you have the idea. And I mean, I've seen stuff like this on. I feel like it's been in the blogosphere or whatever recently. There's a documentary that just came out called "They're All So Beautiful," and I've seen articles about preferences stated on dating sites. And I mean, it's just when it gets to be you see people talking about how Asian women treat men better, or men looking for Asian wives in particular because they expect certain domesticity that they can't get in American women anymore. Like, not to mention that like Asian American women are American women. So I think because of that, and I mean, like, when white men have preferences for black women, I mean, I think that is also sometimes problematic. I mean, my law school roommate is a black woman, and somebody once came up to her and told her he had jungle fever. Like, and that's not okay, right? I mean, so I guess it depends on how it's expressed also. But I think, like, and I was talking to my roommate about this too, like, I think because, like, black women are undervalued in American dating, that there's less of a resistance to that. And I think it is just the power dynamic that between, like, the white man and the Asian women, and the preference for somebody who's just going to submit to your will. I think that's the part that's suspect.
There's another suspect element, though. I guess it's another way of approaching it. I mean, I was thinking about it this way. When I've met some dude, you know, a friend of a friend or whomever, who happens to tell me, hey, I'm into Asian girls, I look upon that with suspicion, even though I'm just another white dude, because that usually means, I mean, in my experience, I like girls who look Asian. Like, it's a very surface thing, and I especially hate to be seen by these guys as a fellow traveler. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's not like...
And I have that same worry about what people think of me and my fiance.
Oh, really?
And also, I mean, there's, like, a flip side to this in that, like, sometimes Asian women who date white men are also looked on with scorn. I think mostly by, like, Asian men and white women, but there's this element of, like, oh, like, you don't, like, and I mean, I think, like, some Asian women also play into this. Like, I know there are Asian women who will say stuff like, I'm not attracted to Asian men, and I think that's really bullshit. But yeah, so I mean,
why declare it?
Yeah, that's so weird.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think being in a relationship with a white man, like, I think about these issues a lot and how we're perceived, and I do generally get more nervous about how he's perceived than how I'm perceived, but it is something that's, like, not far from my mind.
You never want to be, either of us never want to be seen as, like, thinking that our own people are not good enough for us.
Yeah, and that's weird. Or like thinking, like, oh, well, I really value this other culture for reasons that are not necessarily surface too, right? I mean, because a lot of this is also subconscious. I doubt that, like, if you ask most men who express a preference for Asian women, most of them are not going to say, well, I would rather have somebody who's going to rub my feet, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly not a part of it I'd ever thought of. But, I mean, I was trying to think of a devil's advocate question a few minutes ago, you know, to say, we have this teacher who's involved with Iris, Song's younger sister, and he's got the shelf with only Lolita and the Korean dictionaries. And I wonder, is there, to your mind, I mean, is it ever legitimate to be, I mean, it makes sense to me when I think somebody is interested in another culture. Forget even saying Asia, any other culture. Someone's very interested in another part of the world and is, in some sense, intellectually or otherwise dedicated to learning about another culture. It just fascinates them. It makes sense to me that they would choose a person who is from that culture. No? I mean, it's not necessarily an objectionable thing on the face of it.
Yeah, no, that's true, and I have heard that before, and I think, like, this is kind of a sort of case-by-case thing. I mean, I think, like, I don't think it's true that in all of these cases there's something sinister at work. I think it's often true.
Song thinks it's often true.
Yeah.
Maybe always.
I don't know if she goes that far, but I do think it's often true. And I mean, and I think with the teacher and Iris, I also set it up to be, you know, there's just, like, power differentials in, like, every way. And I kind of wanted it to be, like East-West. Like, there is that, you know, the way we think of the East as, like, very Oriental, it's like the East is often thought of as feminine and soft, whereas the West is, like, this frontier, manly, whatever, right? So I wanted to kind of make those contrasts. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's, like, always morally objectionable to have that preference if it really is that, like, you went and lived in Japan for, like, 5 years and, like, you know, communed with all the people there and like really felt like you wanted somebody who was like as immersed in that culture as you were. But I just the frequency that happens and the way that white men talk about Asian women when no one knows who they are, for instance, it's just kind of, it ends up being kind of suspect.
And this affair between the teacher and Iris, the younger sister, does come to a tragic end. And there's, as you've said, you set it up in many different ways to look like there's the power differentials, and there's so many ways in which it looks bad. But it seems like Song also, by the end of the book, reflecting on it, thinks, it seems like there's a seed of doubt in her mind as to whether she should have intervened. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's true. I think a lot of this novel deals with her personal guilt about her dealings with her sister. Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown. Yes. Like that is a movie that I watched when I was in college and like really loved. And I kind of like the idea that like if you hadn't gotten your hands into this, like it could have been so much better, or it wouldn't have been as bad.
Forget it, Song. It's Koreatown.
Yeah, exactly.
Not that much happens in Koreatown in the book, but I was happy that you got all the things correct that are there in Koreatown.
Oh yeah, no, I'm very. Koreatown is one part of LA that I've known since I was a child. It's like the Valley, places my friends lived, and Koreatown.
The seemingly bad guy in this book, the noted lawyer, the father of Luke, Song's best friend, and the one who we think has the mistress, Lori Lim. He is a special target of Song's anger because Song sees him as potentially fetishizing Lori, or fetishizing, I guess, all Asian women thereby, as this sort of laying claim to this exotic young woman. And that word exotic struck me because I think this character, this father, is supposed to be in his mid-50s. And maybe to him, an Asian American like Lori Lim is exotic. To me, a 28-year-old guy in Los Angeles today, Lori Lim is about as exotic as a Buick. I mean, that's going away a bit, right? I mean, generationally, that's a big divide, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and this is something that's always struck me as interesting, is that Asian Americans are still seen as kind of this perpetual foreigner. And people ask, every day, like, I mean, not me every day, but Asian Americans get asked every day, like, oh, where are you from? Like, do you speak blah, blah, blah? Or strangers on the street like to play the guessing game. Like, they're like, are you Japanese? And it's like, this is not a way to start a conversation. And it's weird. And I mean, I always thought that was especially weird in Los Angeles because there are so many of us. I mean, you see Asians all the time. I think I might have merged this anecdote somewhere into this book, but there was one time when I was walking in downtown with one of my best friends, who's also an Asian woman, and this man rolled down his window as he was driving by us, and he yelled out, "Ching Chong Ching." And I was just so baffled by this because, I mean, like, how tired must that guy be if he does that to, like, every Asian person he sees on the street?
It's gotta be a hard life.
I mean, that's like, I can't think of when I would go around this town and, like, not see a single Asian person. It just doesn't happen. And so it's weird because we're so much a part of this landscape, and yet, like, we are still sometimes singled out as being strange or foreign or other.
Right. I mean, but I think, I don't know how old that guy was, but I wouldn't necessarily read a Lori Lim as Korean per se. I mean, like, oh, her parents are probably from there, but I think of her as more American. I mean, do you see it change generationally at all? I mean, there's maybe the guys driving by in the car. Maybe they're older. Maybe you have the William Cooks, the middle-aged lawyer in this book. But I don't know. I feel like younger people aren't, maybe they see Asian Americans as Americans foremost now. Maybe that's too bold to say, but
I mean, I think that's probably true for most people. But I do think that, even as our population becomes more diverse and more mixed, I think even so, there's still this kind of almost impulse to other each other and to recognize differences. And it's strange. And I think it is less in our generation than the previous generation, but I don't think it's gone, even if it is diminishing.
There's a novel, listeners, I recommend you read as a companion piece to Follow Her Home, which is a novel by J. Caspian King called The Dead Do Not Improve. It's also a modern noir, also with a 20-something Asian-American, Korean-American protagonist. And at the core of that book is this idea of the anger that resides inside the Korean man. I wonder if you see a similar anger residing inside Song.
She's definitely an angry character. I'd say that she's more angry about things that have happened in her life, and she's very willing to externalize those. She's not somebody who, I guess, is consumed by her anger, but she is consistently kind of towing that line. And she's not a happy person, certainly. Right. And I didn't mean for it to be like an anger on behalf of like an entire population, but actually, I mean, a lot of it is female anger, certainly, and I guess some of it must be Korean American. But yeah, I mean, she's definitely somebody who sees things that are wrong with the world and feels personally slighted by them probably in a similar way.
How many characters like that do we have in literature? The ones who feel like, is that I'm trying to think if that's a common trait in characters, or if it's not, the sense that what is observed is also personal. Do you know what I mean? I think
that's probably common to a lot of identity novels, actually. If you think of like Invisible Man, for example, or any novel in which the character is part of a group that's kind of marginalized in some way, there's going to be some piece of that. I mean, and I have to say that like I'm not an angry person, but like when the more I pay attention to things that go on and that affect, especially women these days, but, or any marginalized groups, I get angry. And I think that's kind of a normal reaction. I think not everybody internalizes it and makes that kind of their normal state, but it's certainly something that's common to, I'd say probably, this is why like feminists are seen as angry, right? Because like, there are things to be angry about if you just pay attention. So I'm trying to think of specific examples. I mean, I said Invisible Man, but like most. I'm trying to think of, I guess, novels by people of color. I mean, like Native Speaker has some anger to it. I read this post-Katrina noir called Hell or High Water, which is narrated by a woman of Cuban descent, and there's anger there. That's an angry character. That's more about sexual violence, I guess. But I think anytime a character is going to take the sins of the world as a slight against family or tribe, there's going to be some anger by definition. And it's not always a bad thing. It's not always there's like the idea of righteous anger. I think and I'm not saying that all of Song's anger is righteous, but certainly some of it is.
Since you grew up in Greater Los Angeles, what about this place as your hometown did you want to convey in using it as a setting? What are the qualities of it, that you've just experienced it as a place? What do you think was most important to get across in your own experience of here?
I wanted to capture the sense of fluidity in LA, I guess. Maybe that's the wrong way to put it. But I wanted to have like a sense of geography and a sense of movement and a sense that if you go from point A to point B, you can be in a totally different place in half an hour, even 5 minutes. And I wanted to get that across because LA is such a great city in that way. There are all these little pockets and you never know all of them. And you'll continue to find things that are new and interesting. And I kind of wanted that there. I wanted it to be a very geographically concrete novel, and also one that accurately conveyed the atmosphere of LA, what it's like to live in a city where you get in your car and you go someplace and it's a different place always. So I guess that was most important to me. I also wanted to make sure that I captured some of the diversity in the city and the people that she talks to and interacts with. There are a lot of Korean Americans in this novel, and part of that is because there are a lot of Korean Americans in my life, and it just seemed natural to have that. her best friends are white and Puerto Rican. And I definitely wanted to have at least one major Latino character, because I think it's hard to write an LA novel that completely ignores the fact that, half of the city is Latino. I mean, that's the population. And it's true that like the populations are kind of segregated in a way, but I think it's just unrealistic to write for 300 pages and you never run into somebody who's Mexican. And I explicitly wanted Diego not to be Mexican because I wanted to play with the way that Latinos, like Asians, are kind of conflated. And I guess I have like a off-screen character who's Mexican, but so I think that was important to me, that there was some diversity on top of the geography of LA.
And it's easy not to come to know a city that's someone's hometown. If you grew up here, it's easy to not feel the need to know it. But how did you come to know Los Angeles?
I mean, so I grew up in the Valley, which is different. It's very suburban. And, I feel like in my high school life, I spent most of it around like the Valley. I went to the West Side sometimes, hung out on the promenade where a lot of people in high school just hung out. And I knew like K-Town because my parents kept going there. But I feel like I've discovered a lot of LA since like becoming an adult, just because you need a car to discover a lot of LA. You need that freedom. So I feel like I'm still finding out about LA. I feel like I'm still exploring new places and learning new things and meeting different kinds of people. And I like that. I like that LA just keeps giving. You can't turn over every rock living in the city, and that's kind of nice. But yeah, and I feel like I also came to know LA in the same way a lot of people who've never lived here do, through movies, through books. I think there is an artistic vision of LA that rings kind of true in the popular culture. And I think I can't say that my actual knowledge of my own city is untainted by that. And I found it to be, I think when you layer the fictional and the kind of Hollywood landscape over the real city, you do end up getting something that's pretty accurate.
You have to take every layer and put them all on top of each other, and then you see the place itself. If you're missing any one of them, you're not quite getting the image. Yeah.
And I think LA is notoriously, it gets a bad rap compared to, say, New York or San Francisco. I think part of it is it's a hard place to visit because you can't just come and I feel like people come, they go to Disneyland, they go to Getty Center, and then they leave.
Places quite far from the center of Los Angeles as well.
And it's not like those aren't great places, but there's just such a breadth to the city that you're not gonna get much without living here for at least a couple months. And really, it's hard to get a real flavor for the city because there isn't one flavor. And that's true about most cities, but I think it's especially true about a place like LA that doesn't really have one cultural center.
It does seem like, now tell me if you feel this, but the world has also been discovering Los Angeles this past decade in a way that certainly in our lifetimes hasn't been happening. I don't know if you've sensed that.
I think that is true. Although, to be fair, I was not very in tune with images of the city or even other cities 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was still in high school. So I do get the sense that, for instance, LA dining has been, on people's radars outside of the city in the way that, New York dining has been before. And that's just, one small part of it, but that's true. And, I do feel like there are constantly good LA novels coming out, and obviously Hollywood, and anyone who pays much attention to pop culture is going to see images of LA all the time.
And do you see Los Angeles remaining a sort of fruitful source of not just setting but any kind of inspiration for you as a writer, or is it a place you might want to force yourself away from in near future writing experiments?
Yeah, I might change my mind on this in the future. I don't really know, but I kind of see myself as an LA writer. I think I'll continue writing about LA, and I think I'll continue writing about being Korean American in LA. Whether that's peripheral or central to my stories, I mean, that might change, but I definitely see myself as a Korean American LA writer. I don't think there are so many of those that I need to like get out of the way and do something that has been done before. You know, I feel like certain kinds of writing are well covered. You know, there are lots of New York writers, for instance. And I think, you know, I can kind of huddle in this corner, and I hope, like, I mean, and I think, I'm not saying I'm the only one, but, like, it's not a super crowded niche.
Right.
And I'd like to see it more in fiction anyway.
And you might say readers are maybe belatedly, in the main, discovering Los Angeles and Koreanness and the interesting reading possibilities therein sort of now, right? I mean, it's those are... In some way, that city, and that, I mean, I would say that place, but it's not Korea they're discovering. It's something more ambiguous. Both of those things have a lot of potential that's only getting tapped now, right?
Yeah. And I feel like, you know, Anthony Bourdain just did like a Koreatown episode for a show, which I didn't see, but I plan on watching it because it is like a very particular culture. It's not 100% American or even 100%. I mean, it is 100. Okay, I guess what you can say is, like, there's American, and within that there's LA, and then within that there is Korean American, but that is not, it's not quite the same even if you've never even been to Korea. I mean, there's slightly different norms, and it's a strangely small world. And I feel like when I talk to other people about family, for instance, who have Korean American families, like, I feel like we understand each other a little better, even though, like, we're 100% American. My parents speak perfect English, but they're still very Korean in ways that are hard to describe simply, but that I will always be toying with in fiction.
I've been speaking here at the Los Angeles Review of Books headquarters in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, California, with Steph Cha, author of the new Los Angeles noir, Follow Her Home. Steph, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Colin.
This has been the Los Angeles Review of Books podcast. I've been Colin Marshall. You can find much more on the web at lareviewofbooks.org. Thanks.